Okay. Um, if you've read the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, especially the first few pages, it might seem a little bit bewildering. So what I want to do is give you kind of a logical outline of what's going on in there. The first idea he proposes is that all things seek their good. I think, in fact, that's how the book opens. So all things seek good. Okay. Then he refines that and he says that all actions and all ways of knowing or inquiry, what I'm going to call arts, seek good. Okay. Now, the deal is sort of like this. What that means is that if all things seek good, right, they're all looking for good, that would mean that if you consider a tree growing toward the sun, I mean, that is good for the tree, so that's what it does. If you think about, I don't know, what birds flying south for the winter, that's what they do because that's for their good. So all things ultimately act in a way that will continue their flourishing, kind of thing. But then he says, well, actions and arts. Actions are choices, right? Because you have to choose to do things. And by arts, what he means is human ways of knowing. Because here's the thing. Any human good, so if we're talking about good specifically in terms of human, there's always an art that will get us that good. So if we say, for instance, that money is good, well, there's, arts like financial advising and economics that can help us to get the good. So if we choose to be healthy, again, there's an art of health medicine. So actions and arts go together. That is, human beings act on knowing. Okay, so that's kind of what the first little bit means there. Then he gets into this odd, well, what appears odd anyways, discussion about ruling and subordinate sciences. And he says that there are some sciences that are subordinate to others and all that kind of stuff. And the example he uses is bridle making and horsemanship and generalship. And the idea, basically, is that some sciences lead to others. So essentially, imagine this, right? You could say that some sciences are ruling, while others are simply a means to other sciences. As an example, take something like tire manufacturing, right? So there is indeed an art and a science to making tires, but we could say that tires exist because of the ruling science of automaking, right? And so if you think of human endeavors, you think, well, some sciences are means to other ends. Hence, you could look in an operating room and you could see, well, you need a janitor, you need a nurse, you need a surgeon, and they're all important. But the janitor and the nurse are sciences whose means is to a higher end, that of the surgeon and the health of the patient. So that's what he means by ruling and subordinate. But the idea is that not all sciences can be means to other ends. Because if everything was a means to another end, there would never be a ruling science. So the question is, well, what is the highest ruling science? That's the question. And likewise, because we're talking about actions and arts in terms of good, then what is correspondingly the highest good? Because whatever the highest good is, there will be a corresponding highest ruling science that tells us what that good is. And so he says, as to the highest ruling, or the highest good, ruling and subordinate sciences, that's what he means there, is that some sciences and some goods are means and some are ends. And so if most of the sciences are means, well, what are the final ends? That's the question. And so there he tells us that the highest good, the highest end that we're all after, is happiness. That is the highest good. But remember, think of happiness as flourishing, not giggling, he, he, he. So because there is a highest end in happiness, then there must also be a highest science, which then would be, the highest ruling science is the science of happiness. And what does he name this science? It may strike us as odd, but this science is called political science. And so political science, that is the science of ruling cities, as he calls it, is the highest science there is, because political science, the whole point, is to create happiness for the whole. In other words, he means that while we as individuals may be able to find our own ends and our own good, what's higher than our own good is the good of the whole. And so political science is about understanding what is good for everybody, which then will require, if we're after what's good for everybody, we're going to know that since everyone has different understandings of good and different understandings of happiness, well, then we're going to need a science to understand which ends are actually the good ones for the whole. And that is going to require an understanding of human nature. And that's why he discusses what is the function of a soul. Because in order to know what is good for people and good for the whole, you have to know what human nature is like. Not the nature of a rich man, not the nature of a worker, not the nature of a doctor versus a, teacher or something, but human nature. That is, what is the function of it to be human? And so, he says, that in order to understand good from bad, you have to know the purpose of something. You have to know its function, right? And so if you're going to understand a good knife, here's a knife, you're going to have to understand that a good knife is one that is sharp, right? Why? Because the function of a knife is to cut things, right? And if it's sharp, it will cut. Therefore, since this is sharp, we could say that this is a good knife. In other words, you can't understand good unless you also understand function. Likewise, you're not going to say that a sharp hammer is a good hammer because a hammer has a function much different than a knife. Okay, so if we're going to talk about what is good and bad for people, we're going to have to understand what is, first and foremost, the function of a man. And what he tells us is the function of a man is this. The function of a soul. So the function of man is essentially this. A kind of life and activity of the soul in accord with reason. All right. So the deal is, if this is our function, and we say, okay, well, this is what a man is supposed to do, just like a knife is supposed to cut and a doctor is supposed to heal, the next thing we can say is, well, you could judge a good doctor by his, whether he's effective at healing. You can judge a good knife whether it is, effective at cutting. So now we have the purpose of man. We can judge of men being good or bad as to whether they meet this criteria. And so now let's look at what this means. First, he says a kind of life, which means that there are many possible lifestyles, right? So not all of them are going to be good, and it's also going to indicate that we have an element of choice. And indeed, the next question is an activity of the soul, right? So when we say activity, that means a doing or a choosing, right? And he says activity of the soul. Obviously, he means human soul. And so again, remember a long time ago when we talked about the tripartite soul of reason, emotion, appetite. The human soul is this one, the part that is rational. While we do have these are not human. That is, our emotions and our appetites, since we share with plants and animals, they're not specifically what is unique to us. What is unique to us is reason. Reason makes us human. Emotion makes us animal. Appetite makes us alive. Okay, and that's why he says a kind of life and an activity of the soul in accord with reason, because obviously reason is what it means to be human. So therefore, if we are going to be happy, or if we are going to be flourishing, right? So, well, let's say good at this point. Good equals ultimately being and choosing rational things. That's what makes a good man. And this concept is where he wants us to be by the end of Book 2, because in Book 2, we're going to start talking about virtue. And the virtues are about what allows us to choose the good. And that's kind of the logic of Book 1. Now, make sure that you go back and actually read it for yourself, because there's a lot of intricate pieces that we've missed. But this overview hopefully will help you to understand.